have legislation and then we have debates. All day today, starting at 10 o'clock and going through until at least 5:30, to look at the position of Turkey at Myriam Francois-Cerrah, a journalist, Turkey itself has gone through a remarkable transition and development over the last decade or two. And it's a country that's going through changes, but has also a huge historic and political significance for the whole of the wider region, not just the region of the Middle East or West Asia, but the whole of Europe. And the meaning of what happens in Turkey is something that's profoundly significant in all sorts of areas, religiously, politically, economically, socially, in almost every area. There's a very particular meaning to what has been happening in Turkey and what thoughts people have about it. And of course, in the situation in Turkey with the PKK, it's much more complicated because you're also in a strategically significant area with all sorts of other instabilities that have developed in the last 2 or 3 years. We were living in a relatively stable part of the world which was not strategically of any great significance. It was of emotional significance to Irish Americans, but it was of no strategic significance particularly.
Maybe I can say in Tunis there is a small middle class, but not in Egypt, not in Syria, certainly not in Libya. I won't deal with the second term in these neologisms, whether it is an awakening or a spring or a revolution. It doesn't bother me to use either one of them. We all know that we are referring to the same reality. What is a role model at the end? And then I will try to bring to an end my presentation with the question on not how Arabs view a possible Turkish intervention, existence, role, redefines this country's existence in the general Middle East. So my presentation will be rather whether Turks regard themselves as a role model to the Arabs that are looking for change. First of all, what is Turkey? From an established secularist Kemalist perspective, we had an experience of 75 years between 1923 and 2001, I may say, of
returning during that time the army to the barracks and fostering the type of economic growth that we in Britain can only currently dream of. There were no hand choppings, there were no bans on alcohol or nightclubs, and ties with the so-called West have been strengthened, which I'll translate into layman terms as business as usual with Western partners, which to a large extent from an international politics perspective is what it comes down to. However, I share the view of Turkish academic Kerim, and you'll have to forgive my pronunciation, who writes, and I quote, "There is no Turkish model of an Islamist democracy. Rather, there are Muslims in a secular democratic state working within a neoliberal framework." Do I think this is a model which is applicable elsewhere and specifically in the Arab world? I can say, for example, speaking of Morocco, which is a case I know particularly well, that would be a resounding no. In Morocco, the king, who is also known as Amir al-Mu'mineen, or leader of the believers, is both the head of the state and, as I said, a religious figure, leader of the believers.
Iran, I mentioned this in my analysis, falls under the second sphere. Turkey's relations with Iran, the whole deal of vetoing the additional sanctions in 2010 in the Security Council, the fuel swap deal with Brazil, and these are based on sort of more religious and ethnic norms and ties to the Middle East, Caucasus, Balkans, and Central Asia, but although I think the Middle East region has played a much more prominent role probably in the last 7 years in that sphere. And then I would say that the third sphere in which Turkey operates its foreign policy is devoid of any values or norms, and it's just based on pure realpolitik. And I would put its relations with regional powers like Russia, and I put its relations with Iran also in that category, that it's not really based out of any sort of identity politics, but more on realpolitik, and a lot of the energy. I'll start off with the basic premise of my forthcoming book, which started as a project at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And my argument is that Turkish foreign policy presently really straddles through three spheres. The first sphere is basically its very normative ties to the West, based in this traditional transatlantic relationship as a member of NATO, aspirant to the EU and so forth.
The particular speaker had a particular direction of explaining what the model is. So I know in academics we like to define words and then redefine words and not define words and take them apart.
Turkish think tank by means of presentation of Arab image in Turkish media and Turkish movies and so on.
Research areas mainly North Africa, so I'm looking at it from this sort of angle. You were mentioning, in some ways, the
position and its influence in the region. One point I was going to make with regards to Israel is I think that the fact
And the way he's received, that actually has, repercussions of a sense of well-being, I think, for the majority of the population.
The conflict, is it causing any trouble for Turkey's relation with the Arab world?
And so on. But if we take the experience of the United Kingdom, for example, we'll actually go in that kind of direction, not something that can be necessarily in other places, but by lots of other countries around the world because of the old imperial experience. But that doesn't mean that
Ali.
This was actually here in
Well, thank you very much indeed. That's really very kind.
Can I take you with me, please?
I will contact you.
thank you.
It was very interesting. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, so did I.
Please and smile. Very nice photo. Smile me.